The sun had barely risen over Lagos when the first sounds of the construction site began to echo through the dusty streets. Metal rods clanged together. Buckets scraped against the ground. Workers shouted instructions over the noise of mixing cement. A faint orange glow spread across the horizon as the city slowly woke up. For most people in Lagos, the morning meant rushing to offices, markets, or schools. But for the laborers at the half-built estate on the edge of the city, morning meant something else entirely. It meant survival. The site was already alive with activity. Men in dusty boots carried heavy bags of cement on their shoulders. Others pushed wheelbarrows filled with sand across uneven ground. But among them was someone who didn't quite fit the usual picture. A young woman. She moved carefully across the construction yard with a stack of bricks balanced on her head. Her steps were steady despite the weight. Her name was Amara. She was 24 years old, though the hardship in her life had added years to her eyes. Her skin glistened with sweat under the rising sun. A faded scarf was tied around her hair to keep the cement dust away. Her shirt, once blue, was now permanently stained with patches of gray and white from years of working with mortar. Her trousers were rough and worn, and the boots on her feet had small tears along the sides. Yet, despite the exhaustion in her body, she carried herself with quiet strength. Amara carefully lowered the bricks beside a wall that was still under construction. "More blocks!" one of the supervisors shouted impatiently. "I'm bringing them," she replied. Her voice was firm, though slightly breathless. Some of the men nearby glanced at her and chuckled. One of them wiped sweat from his forehead and shook his head. "I still don't understand why they let a woman work here," he muttered. Another laughed. She probably had nowhere else to go. Amara heard them. She always did. But she didn't respond. Instead, she bent down, picked up another set of bricks, and lifted them carefully onto her head. The weight pressed against her neck, but she walked forward without hesitation. Over the past 3 years, she had learned something important. People would always talk. But talk didn't put food in your stomach. Work did. The air around the site grew hotter as the sun climbed higher. Dust floated through the air, clinging to skin and clothes. The smell of wet cement mixed with sand filled the atmosphere. Some workers took breaks under a nearby tree, but Amara kept moving. Block after block, trip after trip, back and forth across the site. Her arms ached, her shoulders burned, but she refused to slow down, because every brick she carried meant something. Another day of survival. Another day she wouldn't sleep hungry. Near the corner of the site, a large mixer rumbled loudly as 2 workers poured cement and sand inside. Amara approached them with an empty wheelbarrow. "Need help?" she asked. One of the men looked at her, surprised. "You've been carrying blocks since morning," he said. "Aren't you tired?" Amara gave a small shrug. "If I stop, someone else will take the job." The man couldn't argue with that. Jobs like these were hard to find, especially for someone like her. She grabbed a shovel and began scooping wet cement into the wheelbarrow. The mixture was heavy and sticky, but she worked quickly, her movements efficient from experience. A few of the other workers watched silently. Despite their earlier jokes, they knew something about Amara that most people didn't. She worked harder than anyone else on the site. Even the supervisor had admitted it once. By midday, the sun was blazing overhead. The workers gathered around a shaded corner to eat lunch. Some brought rice wrapped in nylon bags. Others had bread and soft drinks. Amara sat a little distance away from them on a small pile of unused blocks. From her pocket, she pulled out a small piece of bread that she had bought the night before. It was slightly dry, but she ate it slowly, taking small bites. Beside her was a sachet of water. She tore it open with her teeth and took a sip. The cool water eased the dryness in her throat. For a moment, she allowed herself to relax. Her eyes drifted toward the tall buildings of the city in the distance. From where she sat, the skyscrapers looked like a completely different world. A world of glass towers, shiny cars, and expensive clothes. A world where people never had to worry about sleeping outside. Sometimes Amara wondered what it would be like to live that kind of life. But she quickly pushed the thought away. Dreams like that were dangerous. They could make a person forget reality. And reality was simple. She had no parents, no family, no home. 3 years earlier, she had arrived in Lagos with nothing but a small bag of clothes. Her parents had died in a road accident back in her village. After that, everything changed. The relatives who once smiled at her suddenly treated her like a burden. Eventually, she left. The city had seemed like the only place where someone without connections might still survive. The first months had been the hardest. She had slept under market stalls, sometimes behind shops, sometimes anywhere she could find shelter. Work had been even harder to find. Many employers refused to hire her. Others tried to take advantage of her. But Amara had refused to give up. One day she wandered near a small construction site and saw workers carrying blocks. Without thinking, she approached the supervisor. "Can I work?" she had asked. The man looked at her like she was joking. "This job is not for women." "I'm strong," she insisted. The supervisor laughed. "Carry those 10 blocks across the yard," he said. "If you can do that, maybe we'll talk." Amara lifted the blocks. Every single one. That day she earned her first small payment. Since then, construction sites had become her workplace. It wasn't easy. Some workers mocked her. Some tried to bully her. But slowly, they realized she wasn't going anywhere. She worked harder than most of them. And little by little, she earned their reluctant respect. A loud voice interrupted her thoughts. "Break time is over." The supervisor clapped his hands loudly. "Everyone back to work." The workers stood up with groans. Amara finished the last bite of bread and stood as well. The afternoon passed slowly. The heat made every task harder. Sweat soaked through her clothes. Her hands were rough and scratched from lifting bricks. But she kept going. Near sunset, the sky began to turn golden. The workers started packing up tools and cleaning the site. One by one, they left. Motorcycles arrived to pick some of them up. Others walked toward nearby streets. Within an hour, the busy construction yard became quiet. Almost empty. Almost. Amara was still there. She moved toward one of the unfinished buildings at the far end of the site. The structure had no doors yet, just open spaces where windows would eventually be installed. She stepped inside. The concrete floor was cold beneath her boots. In one corner of the room were a few empty cement bags that she had gathered earlier. She spread them across the ground. Then she sat down slowly. The silence of the evening surrounded her. Outside, the city lights flickered to life one by one. Amara leaned against the unfinished wall. Her muscles ached from the day's work. But she had learned to live with the pain. From her pocket, she pulled out the small amount of money she had earned that day. She counted it carefully. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to buy bread and water again tomorrow. She closed her eyes for a moment. The cool night breeze drifted through the open window spaces. For many people, this building was just another unfinished house. But for Amara, it was home, at least for now. She lay down on the cement sacks and looked up at the open ceiling. Above her, the sky was filled with stars. For a brief moment, a quiet thought crossed her mind. One day, life will change. She didn't know how. She didn't know when. But something deep inside her refused to stop believing. Little did she know that somewhere across the city, a man whose world was made of luxury, power, and wealth was about to make a decision that would bring him directly to this construction site. And when their worlds finally collided, nothing would ever be the same again. Morning sunlight poured through the enormous glass windows of the 32nd floor of Adeyemi Holdings Tower, one of the most recognizable buildings in Lagos. From that height, the city looked almost peaceful. Cars crawled slowly along distant highways like tiny insects. The Atlantic Ocean shimmered faintly at the far edge of the skyline. Tall buildings stretched proudly into the sky, symbols of wealth and ambition. Inside the corner office of the tower stood a man who owned a large portion of those buildings. Daniel Adeyemi. At 32 years old, Daniel had already built a reputation as one of the most powerful real estate developers in the country. His company owned luxury apartments, shopping complexes, hotels, and entire housing estates across Nigeria. but the wealth, power, and admiration that surrounded him meant very little to him most mornings. Daniel stood quietly beside the glass window, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored charcoal suit. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. Tall, broad-shouldered, confident. Most magazines described him as devastatingly handsome, a phrase he had always found amusing. Dark, neatly trimmed hair framed his sharp features. His jawline was strong, and his calm eyes carried the quiet authority of a man used to being obeyed. To the outside world, Daniel Adeyemi had everything. Money, success, power. Yet there was something missing in his life that even billions of naira could not buy. Peace. Behind him, the quiet office door opened gently. "Good morning, sir." Daniel didn't turn immediately. He already knew who it was. Grace, his assistant. Grace had worked with him for almost 6 years. She was efficient, organized, and one of the few people who spoke to him without trying to impress him. "Morning," Daniel said finally, turning away from the window. Grace placed a tablet and several documents neatly on his desk. "You have a meeting with the board in 40 minutes, she said, "and an interview request from Business Africa magazine." Daniel walked toward the desk and glanced at the documents. "Cancel the interview," he said. Grace nodded calmly. She had expected that answer. Daniel hated interviews. Journalists always asked the same questions. How did you build your empire? What inspired your success? What advice do you have for young entrepreneurs? The truth was rarely as glamorous as people expected. Success had come from years of ruthless work, sleepless nights, risky decisions, and more sacrifices than anyone outside his circle could imagine. Grace tapped the tablet again. "There's also a report about the Ajigunal housing project," she said. That caught his attention. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "What about it?" Grace hesitated for a moment before answering. "The construction schedule is behind by 2 weeks. Daniel's eyebrows narrowed slightly. 2 weeks behind schedule might not sound like much, but for someone like Daniel, it meant money. A lot of money. Deadlines in the real estate world were serious business. "Why?" he asked. Grace scrolled through the report. "The project manager says the labor force has been inconsistent. Some workers quit, others are late, and material deliveries have slowed down." Daniel tapped his fingers slowly against the desk. He hated inefficiency. "Has the manager visited the site recently?" "Yes. And he claims everything is under control." Daniel gave a quiet scoff. Everything is never under control when a project falls behind schedule. Grace waited. She knew that look in Daniel's eyes. It meant he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. After a moment, he stood up. "I'll visit the site myself," he said. Grace blinked slightly. "Today?" "Yes. But you have the board meeting." Daniel grabbed his car keys from the desk. "They can wait." Grace had learned long ago that once Daniel made a decision, there was no point arguing. He picked up his phone and slipped it into his pocket. "Send the location to my phone," he added. "Yes, sir." Daniel walked toward the door but paused briefly. "Also cancel my lunch meeting." Grace nodded again. Within seconds, Daniel was gone. Downstairs, the private parking garage echoed with the soft sound of footsteps. Rows of expensive cars filled the space. But Daniel headed straight toward his favorite, a sleek black luxury SUV. The car door opened automatically as he approached. Within moments, the engine roared softly to life. As he drove out of the garage and onto the busy Lagos streets, the city came alive around him. Traffic honked. Street vendors moved between cars selling snacks and bottled water. Motorcycles weaved dangerously through narrow spaces. Daniel had grown up in this city. He understood its chaos. But what frustrated him most about his world wasn't the traffic. It was people. More specifically, fake people. Ever since his success became public, his life had filled with them. Business partners who smiled too much. Socialites who laughed too loudly. Women who suddenly found him interesting the moment they learned his bank account had more zeros than most people could count. He had attended enough charity galas, luxury dinners, and elite parties to last several lifetimes. And every time, the conversations felt the same. Polished, calculated, artificial. Once, he had dated a woman who claimed she loved him deeply. 2 months later, she asked him to buy her a new sports car. When he refused, the relationship ended immediately. That had been the moment Daniel realized something important. Money attracted people, but not always the right people. Over time, he began to keep his distance from most of society. He trusted very few individuals. Grace, his childhood friend Tund, and maybe 2 or 3 business partners. The rest were simply part of the game. As his car moved through traffic, Daniel turned on the radio briefly. A news station was discussing the rising cost of housing in Lagos. Ironically, his company was mentioned. Adeyemi Holdings continues to expand its affordable housing initiative across the city. Daniel switched the radio off. Affordable housing projects had become one of his company's biggest focuses recently. Not because it was the most profitable venture. Luxury apartments made far more money. But Daniel understood something many wealthy developers ignored. The city needed homes for ordinary people. Teachers, traders, drivers, laborers, people who built the city with their hands. The Ajigunal project was one of those developments. Small but decent houses meant for working families. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Nearly 40 minutes later, the tall skyscrapers began to disappear from the horizon. The roads grew narrower. Buildings became older and closer together. Ajigunal, one of the busiest and most crowded areas in Lagos. Children ran along the roadside playing football with a worn-out ball. Street markets spilled onto the sidewalks. Music blasted loudly from nearby shops. Daniel slowed the car as he followed the map on his phone. Soon, the large construction site came into view. Half-built houses stood in rows across a dusty field. Scaffolding surrounded several structures. Workers moved back and forth carrying materials. Daniel parked the car near the entrance. The moment he stepped out, a security guard rushed toward him. "Good morning, sir," the man said nervously. Daniel nodded slightly. "Morning." The guard quickly opened the gate wider. Within seconds, the site manager came running from across the yard. "Mr. Adeyemi, we didn't expect you today." Daniel walked calmly toward him. "That's the point." The manager forced a nervous smile. "Everything is going well, sir. We're making progress." Daniel glanced around the site. Workers hurried to appear busy. Wheelbarrows moved faster. Shovels dug quicker. It was a familiar reaction. The presence of the boss always changed the atmosphere. "Show me around," Daniel said. The manager nodded eagerly. As they walked across the dusty ground, Daniel carefully observed everything. The brickwork, the scaffolding, the mixing stations. He watched how the workers moved, how efficiently the tasks were being handled. Then suddenly, something caught his attention. Across the construction yard, a young woman was carrying a heavy stack of bricks on her head. Her clothes were dusty. Her movements were steady. Unlike the other workers who occasionally slowed down, she moved with determined focus. Step after step, brick after brick. Daniel slowed his walk. "Who is that?" he asked quietly. The manager followed his gaze. "Oh, her." He waved dismissively. "She's just one of the laborers." Daniel continued watching. There was something unusual about her presence. Most workers occasionally paused to rest or complain about the heat. But she didn't. She carried the bricks carefully across the site and placed them beside a wall under construction. Then she immediately turned around to get more. The manager shrugged. "She begged for the job a while ago, said she needed work." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "A woman?" "Yes, sir." The manager chuckled awkwardly. "She's surprisingly strong, though." Daniel said nothing. He continued watching her for a few seconds longer. The sun glowed behind her as she walked across the dusty ground with another load of bricks balanced on her head. Focused, determined, unaffected by the curious stares of others. Daniel couldn't explain why, but something about that quiet strength made him pause. He finally turned away, but the image stayed in his mind. A woman carrying bricks under the blazing Lagos sun. working harder than most of the men around her. For the first time that morning, Daniel felt a small spark of curiosity. And though he didn't realize it yet, that curiosity was about to change everything. The heat of the afternoon sun pressed heavily over the construction site in Ajagunal. Dust swirled through the air each time a wheelbarrow rolled across the uneven ground. The constant clang of metal rods and the dull thud of bricks being stacked echoed around the half-finished buildings. Workers moved back and forth across the site, trying their best to look productive under the watchful presence of the owner of the company, Daniel Adeyemi. Word had already spread quickly among the workers. The billionaire is here. And when the owner appeared at a construction site, nobody wanted to be the person caught standing idle. The site manager walked beside Daniel, wiping sweat from his forehead with a small handkerchief. "This block will be 3-bedroom apartments," he explained quickly, pointing toward a nearly completed structure. Daniel nodded slightly but said nothing. His eyes moved across the site slowly, carefully observing everything. He had visited dozens of projects like this before, but today something felt slightly different. Every few seconds his attention drifted back toward the same figure across the yard. The young woman carrying bricks. She was moving again, balancing another heavy load on her head. She walked steadily across the hot ground toward a stack of unfinished walls. The scarf tied around her hair was stained with cement dust. Her clothes were worn and faded, yet she carried herself with surprising confidence. Daniel stopped walking. The manager noticed and turned back. "Is something wrong, sir?" Daniel gestured toward the woman. "How long has she been working here?" The manager squinted slightly. "Oh, her. Yes." The manager scratched his chin. "I believe she started a few months ago." Daniel continued watching her as she carefully lowered the bricks beside a mason who was working on the wall. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her arm before turning around to go back for another load. "She asked for the job herself," the manager continued. "Said she could carry blocks." Daniel raised one eyebrow. "And you agreed?" The manager chuckled lightly. "At first we thought she was joking." Daniel remained silent. The manager continued talking, unaware that Daniel was paying closer attention to the worker than to his explanation. "But she surprised us," the manager said. "She carried 10 blocks across the yard without dropping any." Daniel's gaze remained fixed on the young woman. "And she works like this every day?" "Yes." The manager shrugged. "She's actually one of the hardest workers here." Daniel nodded slowly. Something about that statement stayed in his mind. Hardest workers. Not for a woman. Not surprisingly strong. Simply one of the hardest workers. Across the site, Amara picked up another stack of bricks and carefully lifted them onto her head. The weight pressed down against her neck and shoulders, but she steadied herself before walking again. She was used to this rhythm. Lift, balance, walk, lower, repeat, for hours every day. But something unusual was happening on the site today. The workers seemed more nervous than usual. The supervisors were shouting more instructions. And several men kept glancing toward the same direction, toward the entrance of the construction yard. Amara followed their gaze briefly. That was when she noticed him, a tall man standing beside the site manager. Even from a distance, it was obvious that he didn't belong to the world of dusty construction boots and cement-stained shirts. His suit alone probably cost more than what most workers there earned in several months. He stood calmly with his hands behind his back as the manager explained the progress of the buildings. Some of the workers whispered quietly, "That's him. The owner. The billionaire." Amara turned her eyes away quickly. She had no interest in wealthy men. People like that lived in a completely different universe. A universe where hunger and homelessness were stories told in newspapers, not things you experienced yourself. She adjusted the bricks on her head and kept walking. Back to work. Across the yard, Daniel noticed something unusual. Most workers had been sneaking curious glances at him. Some even tried to appear overly busy when he looked their way. But the woman carrying bricks had barely looked at him once. No nervous smiles. No attempts to impress. Just work. Daniel found that strangely refreshing. "Let's check the second building," the manager said. leading him forward. They walked across the site. The ground was uneven with piles of sand and gravel scattered around. As they approached one of the structures, several workers hurriedly stepped aside to clear the path. Daniel stepped inside the unfinished building. The concrete walls were still rough and unpainted. Metal rods poked out from the top where another floor would eventually be added. Plumbing installation will begin next week, the manager explained. Daniel nodded absent-mindedly. But just then, movement at the doorway caught his attention again. Amara walked into the building carrying another set of bricks. She stopped near one of the masons and slowly lowered them. Her arms trembled slightly from the effort, but she didn't complain. She simply wiped sweat from her face and reached down for another stack. That was when she noticed the silence. The other workers had paused. The site manager stood nearby, and beside him was the man she had seen earlier, the billionaire. For a brief moment their eyes met. Amara straightened slightly. She wasn't sure what to do. Most workers lowered their gaze when speaking to wealthy employers. But something in her refused to shrink herself. Daniel looked directly at her. Up close, he could see details he hadn't noticed from a distance. Her hands were rough with small cuts and hardened skin from lifting bricks. Dust clung to her clothes. Sweat glistened along her forehead. Yet her posture remained steady, strong, unapologetic. Daniel spoke first. "You work here." The question was simple, but the workers nearby fell silent immediately. Amara nodded slightly. Yes. Her voice was calm, though she could feel several pairs of eyes watching her. Daniel studied her for a moment. "You carry bricks all day?" "Yes." There was no complaint in her voice, just a simple statement. The site manager laughed lightly. "She works harder than most of the men here," he said. Amara shot him a quick look, slightly embarrassed by the attention. Daniel's lips curved faintly. "What's your name?" "Amara." "Just Amara?" "Yes." Daniel noticed the way she answered. Short, direct, no unnecessary politeness. It reminded him of the workers he had known years ago when he first started his company. Before the suits, before the boardrooms, before the wealth. He glanced at the bricks beside her. "That looks heavy." She shrugged slightly. "You get used to it." One of the workers nearby chuckled quietly. "Sir, she can carry more bricks than some of us." Amara shook her head. "That's not true." But Daniel noticed something else. Her voice carried quiet pride, not arrogance, just the confidence of someone who knew her strength. Daniel nodded once. "Good." He turned slightly toward the manager. "Let's continue." The manager quickly led him deeper into the building. The workers resumed their tasks. The moment passed, but Amara felt something strange. The billionaire had spoken to her like she was normal, not like someone beneath him, not like someone invisible, just like another worker. She shook the thought away. It didn't matter. He would leave soon, and life would continue exactly as it had before. Across the building, Daniel continued inspecting the structure, but his mind drifted back briefly to the young woman carrying bricks. Most people in his world tried desperately to impress him, yet she had shown no interest in his wealth or status. Just work. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, that stayed with him. After nearly an hour, the inspection ended. Daniel walked back toward the entrance of the construction site. The workers continued their tasks under the fading afternoon sun. As he reached his car, the site manager spoke nervously. "Thank you for visiting, sir. We'll make sure the project returns to schedule." Daniel nodded. "See that it does." He opened the car door, but before getting inside, he glanced once more across the yard. Amara was there again, walking steadily across the dusty ground with another stack of bricks balanced carefully on her head. Unaware that someone powerful was watching her, Daniel entered the car. The engine started quietly. As he drove away from the construction site, the city streets slowly came back into view. But a small thought lingered in his mind. A woman working harder than everyone else, carrying bricks under the scorching Lagos sun. He didn't know why, but he had a feeling that wouldn't be the last time he visited that construction site. The sun hung high above the construction site, its heat pouring down relentlessly over the unfinished buildings of the new housing estate. Dust floated lazily through the air as workers moved back and forth across the ground. The sharp clanging of metal rods mixed with the rough scraping of shovels digging into piles of sand. It was another long afternoon in Ajagunal. For the laborers on the site, the hours felt endless. Sweat soaked through their shirts as they carried cement, mixed mortar, and laid bricks under the burning sun. Amara wiped her forehead with the back of her arm and adjusted the scarf tied around her hair. Her muscles were already aching, but the day was far from over. She bent down and picked up another stack of bricks. The rough edges scratched lightly against her palms as she carefully lifted them. With practiced balance, she placed the stack on her head and straightened her back. A deep breath. Then she started walking again, step by step across the dusty yard. She had been working since sunrise, just like every other day. The rhythm of construction had become familiar to her. Carry bricks, stack them beside the mason, return for more, sometimes mix cement, sometimes push a wheelbarrow filled with sand. It was hard work, but it was honest work. And more importantly, it kept her alive. Across the site, a few workers whispered among themselves. "Did you hear?" "Hear what?" "The boss is coming again today." Amara barely paid attention to the conversation. Rumors spread easily on construction sites. Most of them meant nothing. But just a few minutes later, a black SUV slowly rolled through the entrance gate. The workers immediately straightened. Some wiped their hands nervously on their trousers. Others grabbed tools to appear busy. The whispers grew louder. "He's here. The billionaire." Amara turned slightly. There he was again. The tall man in the expensive suit. Daniel Adeyemi. He stepped out of the car calmly and spoke briefly with the site manager. From a distance, Amara could hear the manager's voice rising slightly as he explained something about the progress of the buildings. Daniel listened quietly. He looked exactly the same as the day before. Calm, confident, completely out of place among the dusty workers and piles of bricks. Amara watched for only a second before turning away. She had work to do, and people like Daniel Adeyemi didn't belong in her world. She walked toward the building where the masons were working on the second floor. A wooden scaffold stood along the outer wall, allowing workers to climb up and continue laying bricks higher along the structure. Amara climbed the short ladder carefully, balancing the bricks on her head. When she reached the top platform, one of the masons smiled. "Ah, Amara," he said, "right on time." She carefully lowered the bricks beside him. "More coming," she replied. The mason began spreading mortar along the wall. "You should rest sometimes," he said casually. "You've been working non-stop." Amara shrugged. "Rest doesn't buy food." The mason chuckled softly. "You're stronger than half the men here." She ignored the comment and picked up another set of bricks. Down below, Daniel walked slowly across the site with the manager. He was observing the progress more closely this time. "How many workers are here daily?" he asked. "About 40, sir," the manager replied quickly. Daniel nodded. "And materials?" "Deliveries arrive every 2 days." Daniel glanced up at the scaffolding where several workers were laying bricks along the second floor. Among them, he recognized a familiar figure. The woman, Amara. Even from a distance, her movements stood out. She carried the bricks carefully up the ladder and placed them beside the mason without hesitation. While others paused to stretch or complain about the heat, she simply kept working. Daniel watched her for a moment. Something about that determination fascinated him. But just as he was about to turn away, something unexpected happened. A loud cracking sound echoed from the scaffolding. One of the wooden support beams shifted suddenly. The mason froze. "Wait!" Before he could finish speaking, a stack of bricks near the edge tipped forward. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Amara saw it first. The bricks were sliding off the scaffold, directly toward one of the workers below. "Watch out!" she shouted. The worker looked up too late. Without thinking, Amara lunged forward. She pushed the man away just as the bricks tumbled down from above. The heavy blocks smashed against the ground with a loud crash. Dust exploded into the air. Workers scattered in panic. Careful! Move! Someone's hurt! But in the chaos, Amara lost her balance. The sudden movement caused her foot to slip against the wooden platform. Her body tilted sideways. For a terrifying second, it looked like she might fall from the scaffold. Gasps erupted from the workers below. Daniel's heart jumped. But Amara grabbed the edge of the platform just in time. Her injured arm slammed hard against the wood as she caught herself. Pain shot through her shoulder. She gritted her teeth. Slowly, carefully, she pulled herself back onto the platform. The entire site had gone silent. Daniel rushed forward immediately. "Are you all right?" he called. Amara climbed down the ladder slowly. Each movement sent a sharp pain through her arm, but she refused to show it. When she reached the ground, several workers surrounded her. "You almost fell. That was dangerous. Your arm." "I'm fine," Amara said quickly. Daniel stepped closer. Up close, he could see the small cut forming along her forearm where the wood had scraped her skin. Blood mixed slightly with the dust on her skin. "You're not fine," he said. Amara looked up at him. For a moment, she felt strangely aware of how close he was. His expensive cologne faintly cut through the dusty air of the site. His expression wasn't angry. It was concerned. "I've had worse," she said calmly. Daniel frowned slightly. The workers nearby exchanged glances. It wasn't every day someone spoke so casually to a billionaire. Daniel turned toward the site manager. "Why wasn't that scaffold secured properly?" The manager looked nervous. It must have loosened, sir. We'll fix it immediately." Daniel's voice remained calm but firm. "See that you do." Then he turned back toward Amara. "You pushed that worker out of the way." She shrugged lightly. "He didn't see the bricks falling. You could have been seriously injured. That happens sometimes here." Daniel studied her face carefully. There was no fear there, no dramatics, just a quiet acceptance of risk. He found that remarkable. Most people in his world panicked over far smaller problems. "You should get your arm checked," he said. "It's nothing. You're bleeding." Amara looked down briefly at the cut. Then she wiped the dust away with her hand. "It will stop." One of the older workers nearby nodded. "She's tough, sir." Daniel sighed slightly. That much was obvious. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief. "Here." Amara hesitated. Then she accepted it quietly and wrapped it loosely around her arm. "Thank you," she said. The words were simple but sincere. Daniel nodded. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Around them, the workers slowly returned to their tasks. The noise of construction resumed. But something had changed. Several of the workers looked at Amara with newfound respect. She had just saved someone from serious injury. Daniel glanced toward the damaged scaffold. "Work stops on that section until it's repaired," he said to the manager. "Yes, sir." He turned back toward Amara once more. "You should rest today." She shook her head immediately. "I can still work." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You almost fell from a scaffold." "And I didn't." There was a quiet determination in her voice. Daniel couldn't help the small smile that appeared at the corner of his lips. "You're stubborn." "Maybe." He studied her for a moment longer. Then he nodded. "Be careful." Amara nodded slightly. "I will." Daniel walked back toward his car. But as he left the site, he couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Most people ran away from danger. She had run toward it, without hesitation, without thinking about herself. And for the first time since he began visiting the construction site, Daniel realized something. The quiet bricklayer with dusty clothes and tired eyes was unlike anyone he had ever met before. The sun slowly disappeared behind the crowded skyline of Lagos, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple. The construction site in Ajagunal, which had been loud and busy all day, was beginning to grow quiet. One by one, the workers packed up their tools. Wheelbarrows were pushed into corners. Buckets were washed quickly with leftover water. Wooden planks and ladders were stacked against unfinished walls. The long day of labor was finally coming to an end. For most of the workers, this meant going home to their families. Some climbed onto motorcycles waiting outside the gate. Others walked down the dusty road toward nearby streets where buses and tricycles waited. Laughter and tired conversations filled the evening air as they left the site. But not everyone was heading home. Amara remained behind. She sat quietly on a small pile of unused bricks near the edge of the construction yard. Her body felt heavy from the day's work. Every muscle in her shoulders and back ached from carrying bricks under the scorching sun. The small cut on her arm from earlier had dried, leaving a thin line beneath the cloth Daniel had given her. She carefully untied the handkerchief and looked at it. It was clean, soft, probably expensive, very different from the rough cloth she normally used. For a moment, she considered returning it to him. But she knew that would probably never happen. Men like Daniel Adeyemi didn't return to construction sites in the evening. They returned to luxury houses and expensive dinners. Amara folded the handkerchief neatly and slipped it into her pocket. Then she reached into another pocket and pulled out the small amount of money she had earned that day. She counted it carefully. Not much, but enough. Enough for a small meal. Earlier that afternoon, she had stopped by a roadside stall and bought a loaf of bread and 2 sachets of water. It was the cheapest meal she could afford. She tore off a small piece of bread and took a bite. The bread was slightly dry, but she ate slowly, making it last. The evening breeze drifted through the construction yard, carrying faint sounds of traffic from the nearby road. For the first time that day, the place felt peaceful. Amara looked up at the unfinished buildings surrounding her. Rows of houses slowly rising from piles of sand and bricks. One-day families would live there. Children would run through the streets. Lights would shine through the windows at night. She had helped build many houses like these across the city. Yet she had never lived in one. The thought made her smile slightly. Life had a strange sense of humor. She took another sip from the sachet of water. Just then, the distant sound of a car engine broke the quiet. Amara frowned slightly. Very few vehicles came to the construction site at night. The black SUV slowly rolled through the open gate. Her eyes widened slightly when she recognized it. Daniel Adeyemi stepped out of the car. He looked different from earlier. His suit jacket was gone, and his sleeves were rolled up slightly. But he still carried the calm confidence that seemed to follow him everywhere. Amara quickly swallowed the piece of bread in her mouth. She wasn't expecting anyone to see her there, especially him. Daniel noticed her almost immediately. She was sitting alone on the pile of bricks, holding a piece of bread in one hand and a sachet of water in the other. For a moment, he simply stood there. The image was simple, yet it struck him deeply. A young woman who had spent the entire day lifting bricks under the sun, eating bread for dinner. He walked toward her slowly. Amara stood up quickly out of respect. "Good evening, sir," she said. Daniel nodded. "Good evening." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The evening air felt strangely quiet around them. Daniel glanced at the bread in her hand. "Is that your dinner?" Amara hesitated. Then she nodded. "Yes." Daniel looked around the empty construction site. Everyone else went home. "They have homes to go to." Her answer was simple, but something about the way she said it made Daniel pause. "And you?" Amara shrugged slightly. "I stay here sometimes." Daniel frowned. "Here?" She pointed toward one of the unfinished buildings. "Inside there." For a moment, Daniel thought he might have misunderstood. "You sleep here?" "Yes." The answer came so calmly that it took him a second to process it. "You mean you're homeless?" Amara nodded quietly. Daniel looked at her more carefully now. The dusty clothes, the worn boots, the tired eyes that still carried a strange quiet strength. "How long?" he asked. 3 years. Daniel was silent. 3 years. Sleeping inside unfinished buildings. Surviving on small construction jobs. He had built dozens of housing projects across the city. Yet somehow, the idea that someone helping build those houses had no home of her own felt deeply unsettling. "Where is your family?" he asked gently. Amara looked down briefly at the bread in her hand. "They died." The words were soft but steady. "A car accident." back in my village. Daniel felt a heavy silence settle between them. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Amara nodded once. Then she took another bite of bread. Daniel watched her for a moment. You worked all day, he said. Yes. And this is all you eat? She shrugged. It's enough. But Daniel could tell it wasn't. Without saying another word, he turned and walked back to his car. Amara watched him leave, confused. A moment later, he returned carrying a small paper bag. He handed it to her. Take it. Amara looked inside the bag. There was rice, grilled chicken, and a bottle of juice. Her eyes widened slightly. This is too much. It's just food. She hesitated. I can't take it. Why not? Because I didn't earn it. Daniel looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, You saved someone's life today. Amara blinked. I just pushed him. You could have been injured. She shrugged. That happens sometimes on construction sites. Daniel smiled faintly. You're very stubborn. Maybe. After a moment of hesitation, she accepted the bag. Thank you. They both sat down on the pile of bricks. For a moment, the situation felt almost strange. A billionaire sitting beside a bricklayer on a dusty construction site. Amara slowly opened the container of rice. The smell alone made her realize how hungry she really was. She ate slowly at first. But after a few bites, the hunger she had been ignoring all day took over. Daniel watched quietly. You don't have to eat slowly, he said. She laughed softly. I'm trying to make it last. Daniel leaned back slightly, looking at the unfinished houses around them. Why did you choose this kind of work? He asked. Amara wiped her hands lightly. Because someone finally gave me a chance. She told him the story of how she had arrived in Lagos with nothing. How she had slept in markets and bus stations. How dozens of employers had turned her away. And how one construction supervisor had challenged her to carry 10 blocks across a yard. I carried 12, she said with a small smile. Daniel chuckled. That doesn't surprise me. They sat quietly for a moment. The evening breeze drifted through the open spaces of the buildings. Amara finished the last bite of rice and leaned back slightly. That was the best meal I've had in weeks, she admitted. Daniel smiled. I'm glad. She looked at him curiously. Why did you come back here tonight? Daniel thought about the question. Then he answered honestly. I don't like unfinished problems. Amara laughed softly. I'm not a problem. No, Daniel said. You're not. For a moment they simply sat there. Two people from completely different worlds. Yet somehow the quiet conversation between them felt natural, comfortable. Neither of them realized it yet. But that simple meal shared on a pile of bricks was the beginning of something that would change both of their lives forever. The morning sun rose slowly over Lagos, spreading warm golden light across the crowded streets and unfinished buildings of Ajagunal. The construction site was already alive with activity. Workers shouted instructions to each other as they mixed cement and carried blocks. Wheelbarrows creaked across the dusty ground, and the steady rhythm of hammers striking metal rods echoed through the air. It was another busy day. But for Amara, something felt slightly different. As she balanced a stack of bricks carefully on her head and walked toward the building under construction, a thought crossed her mind. Would he come today? She quickly pushed the thought away. Why would he? Daniel Adeyemi was a billionaire. A man with meetings, companies, and responsibilities far more important than visiting a dusty construction site. And yet, for the past 3 days he had returned. Not during official inspections. Not with managers and supervisors following him around. But quietly, in the evenings. Each time, he parked his car outside the gate and walked inside alone. And each time, he ended up sitting beside her on the same pile of bricks where they had shared that first meal. At first, Amara had assumed it was coincidence. But by the third evening, it was obvious. He was coming to talk to her. The thought still felt strange. She had spent most of her life invisible to people with money and power. Yet somehow, one of the richest men in the city seemed interested in her company. Amara! The supervisor's voice interrupted her thoughts. Bring more blocks to the second floor. I'm coming, she replied. She carefully climbed the wooden ladder leading to the upper level of the building. The sun was already heating the concrete walls, making the air thick and heavy. One of the masons smiled when he saw her. "You're quiet today," he said. "Just thinking." "About what?" Amara shrugged. "Nothing important." The mason spread mortar across the wall and began placing bricks. "You've been working here long enough," he said casually. "You should ask the supervisor for a better position." "Like what? Mixing cement or managing materials?" Amara shook her head. "I'm fine carrying blocks." The mason laughed. "You're the only person I know who says that." Amara smiled slightly but didn't answer. She continued working until the afternoon sun began to sink lower in the sky. The hours passed quickly. Lift bricks. Carry them. Place them beside the wall. Repeat. But every now and then, she found her eyes drifting toward the entrance of the construction site. The gate remained empty. By evening, the workers began leaving again. The site slowly grew quiet as motorcycles and tricycles carried laborers back toward their homes. Amara finished stacking the last pile of bricks and stretched her tired arms. The sky was turning deep orange. For a moment, she stood there watching the road outside the gate. Nothing. She shook her head slightly. Of course he's not coming today, she thought. Why would a billionaire visit a construction site every evening? It had probably just been a temporary curiosity. Amara walked toward the unfinished building where she usually slept. But just as she reached the doorway, the sound of an engine echoed faintly through the quiet yard. She froze. Slowly, she turned around. The familiar black SUV rolled through the open gate. Her heart skipped slightly. Daniel stepped out of the car and spotted her immediately. A small smile appeared on his face. "Good evening, Amara." She tried not to smile back too quickly. "Good evening, sir." He walked toward her. "I see you're still working hard. That's the job." Daniel glanced around the now empty construction site. "You finished for the day?" "Yes." He nodded. Then he held up a small paper bag. "Dinner." Amara laughed softly. "You keep bringing food. You keep eating bread. That's cheaper." Daniel shrugged. "I prefer rice." They sat down on the same pile of bricks as before. Amara opened the bag and found 2 containers of food. She looked up at him. "You brought 2. "Yes." "You're eating here?" Daniel leaned back slightly. "Why not?" Amara couldn't help smiling. For the second time that week, a billionaire was sitting beside her on a dusty construction site eating takeaway food. It was the kind of thing no one would believe if she told them. As they ate, the evening breeze drifted through the yard. The city lights began to appear in the distance. "So," Daniel said, "how was work today?" "The same as yesterday. And the day before that." "That's construction work." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Do you ever think about doing something else?" Amara looked at him curiously. "Like what?" "I don't know. Something easier." She shook her head. "I'm not afraid of hard work." "I can see that." She took another bite of rice. After a moment, she asked, "What about you? What about me? Why do you keep coming here?" Daniel thought for a moment. Then he answered honestly, "Because it's peaceful." Amara laughed. "This place?" "Yes." He gestured toward the quiet construction site. "No meetings. No reporters. No people asking me for favors." She raised an eyebrow. "So you hide here?" Daniel smiled slightly. "You could say that." Amara looked at him carefully. For the first time, she noticed something in his expression. Tiredness. Not the physical kind. The kind that came from carrying too many responsibilities. "You must have a very busy life," she said. Daniel chuckled. "That's one way to describe it." They finished their meal slowly. The sky had turned dark now. Streetlights flickered on along the nearby road. Amara leaned back against the stack of bricks. "You know," she said, "if the workers see you here, they'll start talking." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Talking about what?" "A billionaire eating dinner with a bricklayer." "That doesn't bother me." "It might bother them." Daniel shrugged. "Let them talk." Amara smiled faintly. "You're strange. I've been called worse." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence. Then Daniel asked something that surprised her. Amara, what would you do if your life suddenly changed? She frowned slightly. What do you mean? If you had money, a home, opportunities. Amara thought about the question carefully. I'd still work. Daniel looked surprised. You wouldn't stop? She shook her head. Work gives life meaning. Daniel studied her for a moment. In his world, most people work to earn money. But she worked simply to survive, and somehow still found dignity in it. That impressed him more than he expected. Eventually, Daniel stood up. I should go. Amara nodded. Good night. Good night, Amara. He walked toward his car. But before getting inside, he turned back briefly. See you tomorrow. Amara blinked slightly. Tomorrow. Daniel smiled. If you're still carrying bricks. She laughed softly. I will be. The car drove away slowly. Amara stood there watching until the red taillights disappeared down the road. Then she walked back toward the unfinished building. For the first time in a long while, the cold concrete floor didn't feel quite as lonely. And somewhere across the city, Daniel Adeyemi realized something unexpected. For years, his world had been filled with luxury, wealth, and powerful people. Yet somehow, the most honest conversations he'd had in years were happening on a pile of dusty bricks beside a homeless bricklayer. The next morning, the construction site buzzed with its usual noise. The sun had barely risen, yet workers were already moving across the dusty ground carrying cement, mixing mortar, and stacking piles of bricks beside unfinished walls. But beneath the usual rhythm of labor, something else was stirring. Whispers. Low conversations passed quietly between workers as they pushed wheelbarrows and climbed scaffolds. Did you see him again yesterday? Yes, after everyone left. They were sitting over there, talking and eating. One of the younger workers chuckled. I swear that Billionaire comes here just to see that girl. Which girl? Amara, of course. Several heads turned briefly toward the far end of the site. Amara was already working. Like always, she balanced a stack of bricks carefully on her head as she walked across the yard, her steps steady and focused. Sweat glistened along her forehead as the early morning heat began to build. The whispers continued behind her. You think something is going on between them? That man is one of the richest men in Lagos, and she carries bricks for a living. Still, he keeps coming. One of the older masons shook his head. Money can make people do strange things. Amara had learned long ago how to ignore gossip. Construction sites were full of it. Someone was always talking about someone else. But today the whispers seemed louder, more frequent, and she could feel the occasional curious glance following her as she worked. She carried the bricks to the second floor of the building and lowered them beside the mason. The man looked at her with a small grin. So, Amara frowned slightly. So what? You have an important visitor these days. She rolled her eyes. You mean the owner? Yes. What about him? The mason chuckled. He talks to you a lot. Amara wiped her hands on her trousers. He talks to everyone. Not like that. She sighed. There's nothing going on. The mason spread mortar across the wall slowly. You know the workers are talking. Amara shrugged. They always talk. That man is a billionaire. And you're a bricklayer. She lifted another stack of bricks. Exactly. The mason watched her for a moment before shaking his head. You're a strange woman. Amara climbed down the ladder without responding. Across the yard, the supervisor blew a whistle. Faster, everyone. We're behind schedule. Workers hurried to their tasks. Amara grabbed a wheelbarrow and began pushing sand toward the cement mixer. But even as she worked, she could feel the atmosphere around her had changed. Curious looks, whispered conversations. The story of the billionaire visiting the site had already begun spreading, and she had a feeling it wouldn't stop anytime soon. Across the city, Daniel Adeyemi sat in his office at Adeyemi Holdings Tower. The large glass windows behind him showed the bustling Lagos skyline, but his attention was focused on the documents spread across his desk. Construction reports, investment proposals, meeting schedules. Normally, Daniel moved through his work quickly and efficiently. But today his mind kept drifting. Every now and then, a quiet image returned to him. A young woman sitting on a pile of bricks, laughing softly while eating takeaway rice. Grace noticed it almost immediately. His assistant had worked with him long enough to recognize when something was distracting him. "You've read that page 3 times," she said calmly. Daniel looked up. "Have I?" "Yes." He leaned back in his chair slightly. "Maybe it's a complicated page." Grace raised an eyebrow. "It's a budget summary." Daniel chuckled. "You notice everything. It's my job." Grace closed the folder on his desk. "Something is on your mind." Daniel hesitated. He rarely spoke about personal matters at work. But Grace had earned his trust over the years. "I visited the Agigonal construction site again yesterday," he said. Grace nodded. "You've been visiting a lot recently." Daniel looked out the window. "There's a worker there." Grace waited. "A woman," he continued. "She carries bricks." Grace blinked slightly. "A bricklayer?" "Yes." "And?" Daniel thought for a moment. "She's different." Grace crossed her arms. "Different how?" "She works harder than anyone else on the site." "That's impressive." "And she's homeless." Grace's expression softened slightly. "That's unfortunate." Daniel nodded. "She sleeps inside one of the unfinished buildings." Grace studied his face carefully. "And you've been visiting her?" Daniel didn't deny it. "We talk." Grace smiled faintly. "You like her?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "I respect her." Grace leaned back slightly. "Daniel, you run one of the biggest real estate companies in the country." "I'm aware." "And you're spending your evenings on a construction site talking to a bricklayer." Daniel smiled slightly. "Yes." Grace laughed quietly. "Well, that's unexpected." Daniel looked down at the report again. But his mind was already elsewhere. "Maybe," he said slowly, "unexpected things are the most interesting." Back at the construction site, the day passed slowly. The afternoon heat was intense. Workers wiped sweat from their faces as they continued carrying materials and laying bricks. Amara moved steadily through her tasks, trying to ignore the occasional whispers that drifted through the site. But just before sunset, the familiar sound of a car engine reached her ears. She froze for a moment, then slowly turned toward the gate. The black SUV rolled inside. The workers noticed immediately. The whispers returned. "He's here again. See, I told you." Daniel stepped out of the car and walked calmly across the yard. He spotted Amara almost immediately. She was pushing a wheelbarrow full of sand toward the cement mixer. When she saw him approaching, she wiped her hands quickly on her trousers. "Good evening," she said. "Good evening, Amara." Around them, several workers pretended to focus on their tasks while secretly watching. Daniel glanced around the site. "You had a busy day?" "The same as always." He noticed the curious looks from the other workers. "Are they staring at us?" Amara sighed. "Yes." "Why?" "Because you keep coming here." Daniel smiled slightly. "Does that bother you?" "Not really." She leaned against the wheelbarrow. "But the gossip has started." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What kind of gossip?" Amara laughed softly. "You don't want to know." "Now I'm curious." She shook her head. "They think something is going on between us." Daniel paused. Then he laughed. "That's ridiculous." "I know. But construction workers have a lot of imagination." Daniel leaned casually against the wheelbarrow beside her. "Well, let them imagine." Amara looked at him in surprise. "You're not worried about your reputation?" Daniel shrugged. "My reputation survives worse things than gossip." Amara smiled faintly. "You really are strange." "So you keep telling me." The sun dipped lower behind the unfinished buildings. The sky turned orange. Daniel gestured toward the familiar pile of bricks. "Dinner." Amara laughed again. "You're becoming predictable." "Is that a bad thing?" "No." They walked toward the bricks together. Behind them, several workers watched with wide eyes. One of them whispered, "I knew it." Another shook his head. That girl is going to become very important. But Amara didn't hear them. She was too busy laughing quietly as she sat down beside Daniel. And as the evening breeze drifted through the quiet construction site, neither of them realized how quickly the small rumors spreading among the workers would soon reach far beyond the dusty yard. The sky above Lagos darkened earlier than usual that evening. Thick gray clouds gathered slowly across the horizon, swallowing the fading sunlight and casting long shadows over the busy streets of the city. By late afternoon, the wind had already begun to change. Dust swirled across the roads, rattling loose sheets of metal and plastic hanging from roadside shops. People hurried along sidewalks, glancing up nervously at the sky. Everyone could feel it coming. A storm. At the Ajagonal construction site, the workers were moving faster than usual. The wind pushed against the unfinished buildings, whistling through the empty window spaces and half-built walls. The supervisor clapped his hands loudly. Everyone hurry! Pack the tools before the rain starts. Workers rushed to gather buckets, ladders, and wooden planks. The sky had turned almost black. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. Amara lifted the final stack of bricks she had been carrying and placed them carefully beside the wall the masons had been working on all afternoon. Sweat mixed with dust across her face. The wind tugged at the scarf tied around her hair. One of the masons glanced at the sky nervously. "This rain will be heavy," he said. Amara nodded. "I can feel it." Another loud crack of thunder rolled across the sky. Within minutes, the first drops of rain began to fall. Slow at first, then faster. Workers grabbed their bags and hurried toward the gate. Motorcycles arrived quickly to pick up some of them. Others ran down the road, trying to beat the storm before the rain grew worse. The supervisor shouted one last instruction. "Everyone leave. We continue tomorrow." Within 15 minutes, the busy construction site was nearly empty. Rain began pouring down harder now. Water splashed against the dusty ground, turning it quickly into mud. Amara stood beneath the entrance of one of the unfinished buildings, watching the rain fall. The wind had grown stronger. Lightning flashed across the dark sky. She waited quietly for a moment. The rain didn't slow. If anything, it became heavier. Finally, she sighed softly. "Looks like I'm staying here tonight," she muttered. She walked deeper inside the unfinished building where she usually slept. The structure was still raw concrete and exposed metal rods. No doors, no windows, just open spaces where wind and rain could easily enter. But at least it provided some shelter. Amara gathered a few empty cement sacks from the corner of the room and spread them across the floor. It wasn't comfortable, but after years of sleeping in worse places, she had learned to adapt. Outside, the rain intensified. Water poured through the open spaces of the building, dripping along the walls and splashing onto the concrete floor. The wind howled through the unfinished structure. Thunder cracked loudly overhead. Amara wrapped her arms around herself and leaned against the wall. The cold air seeped through her clothes. She pulled one of the empty cement sacks over her shoulders like a blanket. For a moment, she closed her eyes. Storms always made the city feel lonely. Most people were inside their homes with family. Warm food, soft beds, dry clothes. But Amara had grown used to nights like this. Still, tonight felt colder than usual. She glanced toward the open doorway of the building. Rain poured down like a curtain. The road outside was already flooded. Suddenly, a bright pair of headlights cut through the darkness. Amara frowned. A car was approaching the construction site. The black SUV rolled slowly through the open gate. Her eyes widened. "Daniel!" The car stopped just outside the building. The engine turned off. A moment later, Daniel stepped out into the heavy rain. He quickly ran toward the building to escape the downpour. His shirt was already soaked by the time he reached the entrance. When he stepped inside, he froze. Amara was sitting on the cement sacks, staring at him in surprise. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the storm filled the empty building. Finally, Daniel exhaled. "Well, this is not how I expected the evening to go." Amara stood up quickly. "You came in this storm?" "I was driving back from a meeting," he said, brushing rainwater from his hair. The roads are flooded everywhere. He glanced around the unfinished building. Then his eyes returned to her. You're sleeping here tonight? Yes. Daniel looked at the cement sacks on the floor, the cold concrete walls, the wind blowing rain through the open window spaces. A heavy feeling settled in his chest. You can't stay here in this weather. Amara shrugged slightly. I've stayed here in worse. Lightning flashed across the sky. Thunder exploded loudly a few seconds later. Daniel stepped closer to the doorway and looked outside. Rain poured down harder than ever. Driving through the city right now would be difficult, possibly dangerous. He turned back toward her. Looks like we're both stuck here. Amara laughed softly. A billionaire trapped in a construction site. Daniel smiled slightly. Life is unpredictable. The wind blew another wave of rain into the building. Daniel looked around for a dry place to sit. There wasn't much. Eventually, he sat down beside her on the cement sacks. For a moment, they simply listened to the storm. The sound of rain against the concrete roof. The distant rumble of thunder. The whistle of wind through the open walls. Daniel rubbed his hands together slightly. It's colder than I expected. Amara nodded. That's why I used the sacks. She handed him one of the empty cement bags. Here. Daniel looked at it. You're giving me your blanket? You're shivering. He chuckled quietly. You're very observant. He wrapped the sack loosely around his shoulders. You've survived 3 years of this? Amara nodded. At first it was difficult. And now it's just life. Daniel studied her quietly. He couldn't imagine living like this, sleeping in unfinished buildings, facing storms like this alone. Yet she spoke about it as if it were simply another ordinary part of her life. Lightning flashed again. For a brief moment, the bright light illuminated the entire building. Daniel looked at her. You should come with me. Amara frowned slightly. Where? My house. She blinked. That's not necessary. Amara, you can't keep sleeping on construction sites. I've managed so far. Daniel shook his head. That doesn't make it right. She looked down at the floor. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said quietly, I don't want charity. Daniel leaned forward slightly. It's not charity. What is it then? He thought for a moment before answering. It's help. Amara looked up at him. The storm raged outside. Rain continued pouring through the open spaces of the building. For the first time in years, she felt uncertain. Part of her wanted to refuse. She had survived alone for so long. Accepting help felt strange. But another part of her was tired. Tired of sleeping on concrete floors. Tired of cold nights. Tired of facing storms alone. Daniel spoke again, gently. You deserve better than this. Amara stared at him for a long moment. Then she looked out at the rain pouring through the dark construction site. The wind blew another cold gust into the building. Finally, she exhaled slowly. I'll think about it. Daniel nodded. That's all I ask. They sat quietly together as the storm continued outside. Neither of them realized it yet. But that rainy night in the unfinished building was the moment when their lives truly began to change. Morning came slowly after the long night of rain. The storm had finally faded just before dawn, leaving the city washed and quiet. Puddles of water filled the uneven roads around Ajagunal, and the wet ground reflected the pale morning light. Inside the unfinished building of the construction site, Amara stirred from her light sleep. The cold concrete beneath her reminded her exactly where she was. She blinked slowly and sat up. For a moment, she thought the events of the previous night might have been a dream. But then she saw him. Daniel Adeyemi was sitting near the doorway of the building, his back resting against the rough concrete wall. His sleeves were still rolled up, and his once perfectly styled hair now looked slightly messy after the storm. He was holding his phone, reading something quietly. Amara rubbed her eyes slightly. You stayed. Daniel looked up. Good morning. She stretched her stiff arms. You could have left after the rain stopped. The roads were still flooded, he said calmly. And I didn't want to wake you. Amara looked around the unfinished building. The floor was still damp in some places. Water had leaked through parts of the roof during the storm. A few empty cement sacks lay scattered around them. She stood slowly. Her muscles felt sore after sleeping on the hard floor. Daniel watched her for a moment before speaking again. "Did you think about what I said last night?" Amara knew exactly what he meant. The offer. A home. A different life. She walked toward the open doorway and looked out at the construction site. Workers had not yet arrived. The entire place was quiet. For 3 years, places like this had been her shelter. Unfinished buildings. Market stalls. Empty corners of the city. It had never been comfortable. But it had been familiar. Accepting Daniel's help meant stepping into a completely different world. She turned back toward him. "I'm not sure I belong in your world," she said quietly. Daniel stood up. "My world isn't as special as people think." She gave a small smile. "You're a billionaire." "Yes. And I carry bricks for a living. That doesn't make you less important." Amara looked at him carefully. His voice carried sincerity. No pity. No arrogance. Just quiet determination. "You really think I deserve a better place than this?" she asked. Daniel glanced around the empty building. The cold concrete floor. The damp walls. The exposed metal rods sticking out of unfinished ceilings. "Yes," he said simply. Amara was silent for a moment. Then she sighed softly. "All right." Daniel blinked. "All right. I'll accept your help." A small smile appeared on his face. "You won't regret it." "We'll see." Daniel grabbed his car keys. "Come on." Amara looked down at her dusty clothes. "I can't go anywhere like this." Daniel chuckled slightly. "You've seen the inside of construction sites. My house can survive a little dust." She shook her head but followed him outside. The ground squished beneath their boots as they walked across the wet construction yard. The black SUV was parked just outside the gate. Amara hesitated for a moment before climbing into the passenger seat. The interior of the car felt completely different from the world she was used to. Soft leather seats, cool air conditioning, quiet engine. Daniel started the car. As they drove away from the construction site, Amara looked back through the window. The unfinished buildings slowly disappeared behind them. For 3 years, that place had been her shelter. Now she was leaving it behind. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. The city streets grew busier as morning traffic began. Vendors arranged goods along sidewalks. Buses honked loudly. Motorcycles sped past cars in narrow spaces. Amara watched everything carefully. "So," Daniel said casually, "first we stop somewhere to get you some clothes." She looked at him. "You don't have to buy me clothes. You can't stay in dusty construction clothes forever. I've managed so far." Daniel smiled slightly. "You're very stubborn." "I've heard that before." He drove into a shopping district where tall buildings and large stores lined the streets. Amara's eyes widened slightly. She had passed through places like this before, but she had never walked inside the shops. Daniel parked the car. "Come on." They entered a clothing store. The cool air inside felt refreshing. Bright lights reflected off polished floors. A saleswoman approached them immediately. "Good morning, sir." Daniel nodded. "She needs a few things." The woman looked at Amara. Her dusty boots and worn clothes clearly stood out in the elegant store. But Daniel's presence erased any judgment from the woman's expression. "Of course," the saleswoman said politely. Amara felt slightly uncomfortable as the woman showed her different dresses, shirts, and shoes. "This one would look lovely on you," the woman said, holding up a simple but elegant dress. Amara looked at Daniel. "This feels strange." Daniel leaned casually against a display shelf. "Trying new things always does." After some hesitation, Amara finally chose a few simple outfits. Nothing flashy, just comfortable clothes. Daniel paid for everything without hesitation. They stopped at a salon next. Amara nearly refused at first, but after some persuasion, she agreed to have her hair washed and braided neatly. When she finally looked at herself in the mirror afterward, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Her hair was neatly styled. Her face looked refreshed. The exhaustion she carried from years of hardship seemed slightly softer. Daniel stood nearby watching quietly. "You look different," he said. Amara smiled. "I feel different." They returned to the car. "Ready to see your new place?" Daniel asked. "My new place?" she repeated. "Yes." Amara looked at him suspiciously. "You didn't tell me about that part." Daniel laughed. "I thought surprises were nice." They drove across the city toward a quieter neighborhood. Tall trees lined the streets. Modern apartment buildings stood neatly along the road. Daniel parked in front of one of them. "This is it." Amara stepped out of the car slowly. She looked up at the building. "This place looks expensive." "It's comfortable." Inside, Daniel led her to a small but beautiful apartment. The living room had soft furniture and large windows that allowed sunlight to fill the space. The kitchen was modern and clean. There was even a small balcony overlooking the street. Amara walked slowly through the rooms. Her fingers brushed the smooth surfaces of the furniture. "You arranged all this?" she asked. "Yes." "For me?" "Yes." She turned toward him. "You barely know me." Daniel smiled. "I know enough." Amara walked toward the bedroom. A neatly made bed stood against the wall. Soft blankets. Clean sheets. For a moment, she simply stared at it. Then she sat down slowly. The mattress sank comfortably beneath her weight. She laughed softly. "I forgot beds could feel like this." Daniel leaned against the doorway. "Get used to it." Amara looked around the room again. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar. Safety. Warmth. Stability. But after a moment, she stood up again. "There's one condition," she said. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What condition?" "I'm still working." "At the construction site?" "Yes." Daniel looked surprised. "You don't have to." "I want to." "Why?" Amara crossed her arms. "Because that job is part of who I am." Daniel studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. "All right. You're serious?" "Yes." Amara smiled slightly. "Good." Daniel walked toward the balcony and looked out over the quiet street below. "Then I guess tomorrow morning." He turned toward her. "You'll still be carrying bricks." Amara laughed. "Yes." And as the sun slowly filled the apartment with warm light, she realized something important. Her life had just changed forever. But she wasn't leaving her past behind. She was simply building something new, one brick at a time. The sun shone brightly over Lagos the next morning, reflecting off glass buildings and busy streets as the city came alive once again. Inside the small apartment Daniel had arranged, Amara stood near the window, watching the early traffic below. Cars moved slowly along the road. Street vendors arranged fruits and snacks beside the sidewalk. A bus conductor shouted loudly as passengers hurried to board. Everything looked normal. Yet to Amara, the world felt slightly different today. For the first time in 3 years, she had woken up in a real bed. The soft mattress had felt strange at first. She had tossed and turned several times during the night, not used to such comfort. Even the silence of the apartment had felt unfamiliar. No dripping rain. No cold wind pushing through unfinished walls. No hard concrete floor. Just quiet. She wrapped her arms around herself and smiled softly. "So this is what normal life feels like," she thought. But despite the comfort around her, one thing remained the same. She was going back to work. Amara walked into the bedroom and picked up the simple clothes she had chosen the day before. Not the elegant dress the saleswoman had suggested. Instead, she wore a comfortable shirt and strong trousers, clothes she could move easily in. When she finished dressing, she tied a scarf around her hair the same way she always had before carrying bricks. Some habits were difficult to change. She glanced at herself in the mirror. Even in simple clothes, she looked different now. Cleaner, healthier. But the determined expression in her eyes remained the same. After grabbing a small bag, she stepped out of the apartment. The construction site was already busy when she arrived. Workers moved across the yard carrying tools and materials as usual. But the moment Amara walked through the gate, something strange happened. Several workers stopped what they were doing. Others whispered quietly. One of the younger laborers nudged his friend. Look, is that? It's her. Amara noticed the attention immediately. She frowned slightly. The mason she usually worked with stared at her in disbelief. Amara? Yes. What happened to you? She raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? You look different. Another worker joined them. Where did you get those clothes? Amara shrugged. I bought them. With what money? She didn't answer. Instead, she walked toward the pile of bricks and lifted several onto her head. Just like always, the workers exchanged confused glances. She still carries bricks? I thought she... Shoo! But the whispers didn't stop. The story had already spread across the site. Everyone knew the billionaire had been visiting her. Now she had suddenly disappeared from the construction site the night of the storm, and returned looking completely different. Rumors grew quickly. The supervisor approached cautiously. You didn't come yesterday morning, he said. I had something to do. He looked at her carefully. Well, you're back now. Yes. He scratched his head slightly. You still want to work? Amara adjusted the bricks on her head. Yes. The supervisor shrugged. All right then. As she walked toward the building under construction, several workers stared at her. But Amara ignored them. Work was work. And she wasn't about to stop just because her life had changed slightly. Across the city, Daniel sat inside his office. He had been staring at the same email for several minutes without reading it properly. Grace noticed immediately. You're distracted again. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Maybe. Grace closed the folder she was holding. You visited the construction site again yesterday. Daniel nodded. Yes. And? Daniel smiled slightly. She agreed to accept help. Grace raised an eyebrow. That's good. I arranged an apartment for her. Grace looked impressed. That was generous. Daniel stood and walked toward the window. Below him, the city stretched endlessly. I'm taking her to dinner tonight. Grace smiled knowingly. So this isn't just about helping a worker anymore. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched the cars moving far below. Finally, he said quietly, I think I'm falling in love with her. Grace blinked. That was fast. Daniel chuckled softly. Not really. Grace crossed her arms. You're serious? Yes. Grace studied his face carefully. In all the years she had worked for him, she had never seen him talk about anyone like this. Well, she said finally, I hope she deserves you. Daniel smiled. She deserves more than me. That evening, Amara returned to her apartment after another long day of work. She had carried bricks, mixed cement, climbed scaffolds, just like always. But today something else had followed her throughout the day. Curiosity, workers watching her, whispers spreading across the site. By the time she reached the apartment, she felt exhausted. She had just finished washing the dust from her hands when her phone rang. Daniel. Hello. Good evening, Amara. Good evening. How was work? The same as always. He laughed. You still carried bricks? Yes. I'm impressed. There was a brief pause. Are you free tonight? Daniel asked. For what? Dinner. Amara hesitated. You've already fed me many times. This time it's a proper dinner. Where? You'll see. Amara looked down at her dusty clothes. I don't think I look like someone who belongs in a fancy restaurant. You belong anywhere you want. She smiled softly. All right. I'll pick you up in 30 minutes. Daniel arrived exactly on time. When Amara stepped outside the apartment building, he was leaning casually against his car. He looked up and smiled. You clean up well after construction work. Amara laughed. You're still strange. Get used to it. They drove across the city as night lights flickered on across Lagos. Daniel eventually parked outside a quiet restaurant overlooking the water. It wasn't overly glamorous, but it was elegant. Inside, soft music played while people enjoyed quiet conversations over dinner. Amara looked around slightly nervously. I feel like everyone can tell I carried bricks today. Daniel smiled. I can't. They sat at a table near the window. The waiter brought menus. Amara studied the list of food carefully. This is expensive. Daniel leaned back. That's my problem. After ordering, they began talking. About work. About the construction site. About the strange gossip spreading among the workers. But eventually the conversation slowed. A quiet moment settled between them. Daniel looked at her. Amara. Yes. There's something I need to say. She looked up. His expression had grown serious. For a moment he hesitated. Daniel Adeyemi was a man who negotiated million-dollar deals without fear. But right now, speaking felt strangely difficult. Finally, he took a breath. I think I've fallen in love with you. Amara froze. The restaurant sounds seemed to fade around them. You what? I know it sounds sudden. You're a billionaire, she said quietly. And I'm a bricklayer. Daniel shook his head. No. What do you mean? You're the strongest woman I've ever met. Amara stared at him. You barely know me. I know enough. You know I sleep on construction sites. You used to. You know I carry bricks for money. And you do it with pride. Amara felt her heart beating faster. Daniel. Yes. People will laugh. Let them. Your friends will think you're crazy. That's already true. Despite herself, Amara laughed softly. You're serious about this? Daniel nodded. Completely. She looked down at the table. Her entire life had been about survival. Work, food, shelter. Love had never been part of the plan. But now a man from a completely different world was sitting across from her, saying he loved her. Finally, she looked up again. I don't know what the future looks like, she said slowly. Neither do I. But I know one thing. What? I don't want to stop seeing you. Daniel smiled. That's a good start. Outside the restaurant window, the lights of Lagos shimmered across the dark water. And for the first time since their worlds had collided, both of them realized something. This was no longer just friendship. It was the beginning of something far deeper. The news began as a whisper. Like most rumors in Lagos, it started small, passing quietly between workers at the construction site. The boss is dating her. Which boss? Daniel Adeyemi. And who is the woman? The bricklayer. Within days, the whisper had turned into conversations. Workers talked about it during lunch breaks. Drivers repeated the story to passengers. Street vendors discussed it while selling fruit and roasted corn. Soon the story spread beyond Ajigunal. A billionaire and a bricklayer. Many people didn't believe it at first. But those who worked on the construction site had seen it with their own eyes. Daniel Adeyemi visiting after work. Sitting with Amara. Talking. Laughing. Then came another piece of gossip that made the story even bigger. She doesn't live on the construction site anymore. He bought her an apartment. Still, she comes back every day to carry bricks. That detail amazed people the most. Why would a woman dating a billionaire continue doing manual labor? But anyone who truly knew Amara understood the answer. Because she was proud of who she was. Meanwhile, Daniel's world was becoming increasingly curious about his new relationship. At Adeyemi Holdings Tower, Grace closed a newspaper on her desk and walked into Daniel's office. You're trending. Daniel looked up from his laptop. That sounds dangerous. Grace placed the newspaper in front of him. A small article sat near the bottom of the page. Mysterious woman seen with billionaire real estate developer. Daniel read the headline and laughed softly. That was fast. Grace sat down across from him. You knew this would happen. Yes. And you don't care? Daniel leaned back in his chair. Should I? Grace studied his face carefully. You're serious about her. Daniel nodded. Very. Grace smiled slightly. Then I guess I should prepare for the wedding. Daniel blinked. Wedding? Grace crossed her arms. You look like a man who's already thinking about it. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the newspaper again. The words felt strangely distant compared to the real woman he knew. The hardworking bricklayer who laughed easily and refused to stop working even after moving into a comfortable apartment. After a moment, Daniel smiled quietly. You're not wrong. Grace raised an eyebrow. You are thinking about it. Daniel stood up and walked toward the window. Below him, Lagos stretched endlessly with its endless movement and noise. I've spent my entire life building things, he said. Buildings, companies, investments. Grace waited. But none of that ever felt personal. He turned toward her. Until now. Grace nodded slowly. Well then. What? You should stop thinking and do it. Daniel smiled. Maybe I will. A few days later, the sun shone brightly over the construction site in Ajagunal. Workers moved across the yard carrying cement and bricks as usual. Amara wiped sweat from her forehead as she balanced another stack of bricks on her head. Life had returned to its familiar rhythm. But now, every time Daniel visited the site, the workers watched with curiosity. Some smiled knowingly. Others whispered among themselves. The mason she often worked with chuckled as she lowered the bricks beside him. So, when is the wedding? Amara rolled her eyes. You people never stop talking. But it's true. He hasn't proposed. Yet. She laughed softly. You're all crazy. The mason placed another brick carefully onto the wall. You deserve happiness, Amara. She didn't answer. Instead, she climbed down the ladder to collect more bricks. Despite the gossip and attention, one thing remained constant. She still worked as hard as she always had. Daniel admired that about her. That evening, after the workers had gone home, Daniel arrived at the construction site again. Amara was sitting on their usual pile of bricks, drinking water from a small bottle. When she saw him, she smiled. You're late today. Business meeting. You still look like a businessman. Daniel looked down at his suit. That's unfortunate. She laughed. Sit. He joined her on the bricks. The evening sky glowed orange behind the unfinished houses. Work was hard today? He asked. The usual. Daniel nodded. Good. Amara looked at him curiously. You're smiling. Am I? Yes. What's wrong with smiling? You usually only smile when you're planning something. Daniel chuckled. You know me too well. She leaned back against the bricks. So what are you planning? Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he looked around the construction site. The buildings that once stood as empty structures were now nearly complete. Windows had been installed. Roofs were finished. The houses were ready for families to move in soon. Do you remember the first day we met? He asked. Yes. You were carrying bricks. I still am. Daniel stood up slowly. Come with me. Amara frowned. Where? You'll see. Curious, she followed him across the construction yard. They stopped in front of one of the finished houses. The front door was newly installed. Fresh paint covered the walls. This house was part of the original project, Daniel said. Amara looked around. It's beautiful. Daniel opened the door and stepped inside. The house was fully completed. Clean floors, painted walls, large windows allowing warm evening light to enter. Amara walked slowly through the living room. Who's moving in here? She asked. Daniel smiled. That depends. On what? He stepped closer to her. On your answer. Amara blinked. My answer. Daniel reached into his pocket. Her heart skipped slightly. He knelt down on one knee. For a moment, Amara simply stared at him. Daniel Adeyemi, the billionaire, kneeling on the floor of a house she had helped build. Amara, he said softly, you walked into my life carrying bricks on your head. She laughed nervously. That's not very romantic. It's honest. He opened the small box in his hand. Inside was a ring. Simple, elegant, but beautiful. You taught me something important, Daniel continued. What? That strength isn't measured by money. Her eyes began to fill with tears. You showed me courage, dignity, and kindness in ways I had never seen before. He took a breath. Amara, will you marry me? The room fell completely silent. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Memories flashed through her mind. Sleeping on cold concrete floors. Working under the burning sun. Carrying bricks just to survive. Now a man who could have chosen anyone in the world was asking her to marry him. Finally, she laughed through her tears. "You're serious?" Daniel smiled. "Very." She wiped her eyes. "You know people will never stop talking. I hope they don't. And your friends. They'll survive." Amara shook her head slowly. "You're crazy. That's not an answer." She looked at the ring again, then back at him. "Yes." Daniel's smile widened. "Yes. Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he stood up and pulled her into a warm embrace. Outside, the last light of the sunset shone through the windows of the house she had once helped build. And for the first time in her life, Amara truly felt like she had come home. The news of the engagement spread faster than anyone expected. Within days, nearly everyone connected to Daniel Adeyemi's world had heard the story. A billionaire real estate developer, engaged to a former homeless bricklayer. Some people were shocked. Some people laughed. Others were simply curious. But no matter what anyone thought, one thing was certain. The entire city wanted to see this wedding. Inside Adeyemi Holdings Tower, Grace stood in Daniel's office holding a stack of papers. She placed them neatly on his desk. "These are the final wedding plans," she said. Daniel glanced at the documents. "I didn't know weddings involved this much paperwork." Grace smiled. "You're marrying a woman the entire city is talking about." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "I'm marrying Amara." Grace nodded. "Yes, but the world sees something different." "What do they see?" "A billionaire marrying a bricklayer." Daniel shrugged. "Then let them watch." Grace crossed her arms. "They will." Meanwhile, across the city, Amara sat quietly in the living room of her apartment. A wedding planner stood nearby showing her different designs for dresses. "This one is very popular," the woman said, holding up a beautiful white gown with delicate lace. Amara stared at it in disbelief. "People actually wear this?" The planner laughed softly. "Of course." Amara shook her head. 3 years ago, I was sleeping inside unfinished buildings." The planner smiled warmly. "And now you're about to become the wife of one of the richest men in the country." Amara looked down at the ring on her finger. Sometimes it still felt unreal. But one thing remained the same. She was still the same woman. The same bricklayer who had carried blocks under the burning sun. Daniel had never tried to change that. That was one of the reasons she loved him. Finally, she pointed to the dress. "This one." The planner beamed. "Excellent choice." The days leading up to the wedding passed quickly. Friends, business partners, and curious members of the public talked endlessly about the unusual couple. Some people doubted the relationship. "He'll get bored eventually." Others were impressed. Maybe true love still exists. But none of those opinions mattered to Daniel or Amara. To them, the wedding was simply the next step in their story. The morning of the wedding arrived with clear blue skies. Sunlight poured gently across the city as preparations began early. The ceremony would take place in a beautiful outdoor venue overlooking the water. White chairs were arranged neatly beneath a large decorated arch. Flowers lined the walkway leading to the altar. Soft music played as guests began arriving. Luxury cars pulled up one after another. Business executives, celebrities, friends, even some curious journalists. Many of them whispered as they took their seats. "Have you seen the bride? They say she used to carry bricks. I heard she was homeless." Grace sat near the front of the ceremony area. She watched the guests quietly with a small smile. Let them whisper. Soon they would see the truth. Inside a nearby room, Amara stood in front of a large mirror. Her wedding dress flowed softly around her. Her hair was styled neatly with delicate decorations woven into the braids. For a moment, she simply stared at her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked elegant, confident, beautiful, but deep down, she was still the same girl who had once balanced stacks of bricks on her head. There was a gentle knock on the door. Grace stepped inside. "You look stunning." Amara smiled nervously. "I feel like someone else." Grace shook her head. "No, you look exactly like the woman Daniel fell in love with." Amara took a deep breath. Is everyone here? Yes. And Daniel? Grace laughed. He's trying to look calm. Amara smiled. Trying? Yes. He's failing. They both laughed softly. Grace gently squeezed her hand. Ready? Amara nodded slowly. Yes. Outside, the music shifted. Guests turned their heads toward the entrance. Daniel stood at the altar wearing a tailored suit. For a man who negotiated massive business deals without fear, his heart was beating faster than usual. His friend Tund leaned toward him. You look nervous. Daniel smiled slightly. Just excited. Tund chuckled. Sure. The music grew louder. Then everyone stood. Amara appeared at the end of the aisle. A soft gasp moved through the crowd. She looked radiant, elegant, graceful. But there was something else in the way she walked. Confidence. The quiet strength of someone who had faced life's hardest challenges and survived. Step by step, she walked down the aisle. Daniel watched her with a smile he couldn't hide. In that moment, he didn't see a former bricklayer. He saw the woman who had changed his life. When she reached the altar, they stood facing each other. The officiant began the ceremony. Friends and family listened as vows were exchanged. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he took Amara's hands gently. I built my life creating buildings and businesses, he said. But you showed me something more important. Amara smiled softly. What's that? That the strongest foundations are built with love. Several guests wiped tears from their eyes. Then it was Amara's turn. She looked at Daniel. For years I carried bricks just to survive. She paused. But somehow those same bricks led me to you. Daniel laughed quietly. And I promise, she continued, to build a life with you that is stronger than any building in this city. The officiant smiled. Well then, I think we're ready. He raised his hands slightly. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Daniel didn't wait. He leaned forward and kissed her. The crowd erupted into applause. Even the guests who had arrived with skepticism now smiled warmly. Because in that moment, the truth was obvious. This wasn't a story about money. It wasn't a story about status. It was a story about love. Later that evening, the reception was filled with laughter and celebration. Music played. People danced. Lights shimmered across the venue. Daniel and Amara stood together on the balcony overlooking the water. The city lights sparkled across the dark surface below. Amara leaned against him. Do you remember the first time we talked? She asked. Of course. You asked if the bricks were heavy. And you said you were used to it. She smiled softly. Life feels lighter now. Daniel wrapped his arm around her. That's because you don't have to carry everything alone anymore. Amara looked out across the city. Somewhere out there was the construction site where everything had started. The place where a homeless bricklayer had met a curious billionaire. Funny, she said quietly. What is? Love built our life the same way I built houses. Daniel raised an eyebrow. How? Brick by brick. Daniel smiled. And as the music played behind them and the night stretched beautifully across the city, the billionaire and the bricklayer began the next chapter of their lives together. A life built on love, strength, and the unexpected ways destiny sometimes works. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to this channel and tell us where you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.